The civil war in Sierra Leone resulted in the death of over 70,000 people. An estimated 2.5 million people were also displaced during the conflict. Numerous atrocities were committed, causing many of the perpetrators of violence to be tried in international criminal courts. At the end of the war, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established to provide a degree of accountability for human rights abuses committed during the conflict. The recovery of Sierra Leone from this devastating conflict is an important topic that needs to be studied carefully. In this special episode of the book series, I quote the director of the Conflict Resolution Program at Portland State University in Oregon. His new book, Civil Society and Peacebuilding in Sierra Leone, Donors, Government, and Human Security, was published by Routledge. A copy of this book can be accessed on the link that is in the description panel of this video. Enjoy the show. Dr. Kanyako, thank you so much for making the time. I greatly appreciate you coming to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I've been looking forward to this for quite a long time. So thank you for having me on this prestigious platform.
That is wonderful. I was happy. I should show you this. I was happy to receive this. I received it a couple of months ago, and I took my time to read all of the books. Unfortunately, we can't discuss all of them today. We're just scheduled to discuss just one. But I would have loved to, to talk about all of the books, all of them, so that we get to learn from you. You have done a very wonderful job. Your books are very easy to read, and I find them to be very insightful and very useful, especially to university students that are doing research into these subjects: conflict studies, post-conflict reconstruction, and peace building. These are very critical issues in communities that have been affected by war. So to get us started with our conversation today, I want you to introduce yourself to us and to our audience, and just tell us briefly, who is Dr. Kanyako? Where are you currently affiliating? What research do you do? What classes do you teach? What works have you been working on before the publication of this book?
Thank you again, Anotida. It's a pleasure to be here. Vandy Kanyako. I am the director of the Conflict Resolution Program at Portland State University in what they call the Pacific Northwest of the United States. So it's in the state of Oregon. And Oregon, for those of you that may be wondering, is one of the largest states that's just wedged between California and Washington state. So I am the director of the Conflict Resolution Program, which, it's a graduate program. We originally started as a graduate program, but we now have undergraduate programs as well. And this was founded over 25 years ago. So it's one of the older graduate program in peace and conflict studies in the world, actually. I have been here in Portland for the last 11 years. This is year 12, believe it or not. And it's been a really wonderful experience, so to speak. And so I teach various courses on human rights, civil society, post-conflict peace building. So I'm always interested in, among others, the role of civil society, especially vis-a-vis that of the state and in business. Mm-hmm. I'm also interested in the bigger picture. So I do research on issues around global governance, but also on democracy, human rights, human security, which is really what my latest book is about. But as you showed in the beginning, one of my earliest works was really on energy security in West Africa in particular. In that book, I looked at the implication of the ongoing discoveries of hydrocarbons, especially oil and gas, on the West African sub-region, and the implication of that for peace and security in that region, but also around the world. And so my research interests really are very, very varied. But I also do a lot of my work on issues around sub-Saharan Africa, especially the implications of the post-colonial era on contemporary societies in Africa.
That is wonderful. Thank you very much for that. I would very much like us to to start to talk about civil society. But you did a good job with this book.
Thank you.
Oil revenue security and stability in West Africa. Before we get to start to talk about this one, I just want you to just briefly give our audience some highlights of what are the key ideas, main ideas that you talk about in this particular book.
Yes, thank you. So the main idea, so this book came out in 2020. So just about the time when COVID sort of, was beginning to take effect around the world. So in the book, I looked at the ongoing discoveries of oil in West Africa, hydrocarbons, but particularly oil in West Africa. And part of the idea there is that ever since September 11th, ever since the terrorist attacks on the United States, the US in particular, but also other major Western governments have been looking for alternative sources of energy around the world because they realize that, parts of the Middle East is a little unstable or they are not as welcome. And so they started looking for alternative sources. And as a result of that, but also with the advancement in technology, which made it possible to be able to search for hydrocarbons in places that were not possible before, has led to this sort of mad rush for West Africa's hydrocarbons. So everything, Nigeria is usually associated with oil, but a lot of other countries, Gabon, and of course, Ghana, all of these countries are now discovering oil in commercial quantity. And so I was very much interested in sort of learning about what is the implication of the ongoing discovery of oil on human rights and human security. And so the research for this book took me all across West Africa. So I spent a lot of time in Ghana. I visited some of the oil refineries. I went to Nigeria and as far as Equatorial Guinea, which is one of the oil resource countries in the sub-region. So I really wanted to find out, what are governments thinking? What are the role of civil society? What kinds of discussions are taking place in these countries to ensure that these resources are properly managed? And so this research really involved talking to a broad spectrum of various agents and actors within these countries to get a better sense, because as we all know, there is the phenomenon called resource cost.
Yes.
So just because a country has oil doesn't mean those resources or the proceeds are going to translate to development. And so my goal was to try to understand what were the undercurrents and what were societies doing or thinking about doing to properly manage these resources so that they don't become a cost, but rather as tools that can help these countries to actually develop. And so really, in a nutshell, that's what this book is about. I wanted to kind of see so that we can foster discussions around the implications of the discovery of oil, not only for West Africa, but for the global economy in general, because everybody is there, China, India, A lot of these other developing countries, they're all there. There are
Mm-hmm.
over 500 oil and gas companies, looking for oil in
Mm-hmm.
this region.
Oh, yes, yes, that's very true. Viewers and listeners, do not forget to click the link that is in the description panel on the upload for this video. This is one of the books that was authored by Dr. Vandy Kanyako. It was published by Palgrave Macmillan. You can just click the link and access it and get a copy. So now I want us to talk about civil society and peace building. I
Yes.
understand the backdrop to this book is the civil war in Sierra Leone, which sometimes I think not a lot of us understand it very, very well. So I want you to tell us about the core ideas of this book and what you consider to be its central argument. But please, if you can, please contextualize how the Sierra Leone civil war is at the backdrop of this whole discussion that you make in this book.
Yes, thank you so much. Wonderful question. So yes, as you rightly said, the book deals with the role of civil society in peace building in Sierra Leone. And Sierra Leone, just to kind of provide that context that you asked for, the civil war there started in 1991, right up to about 2002, give or take. So it lasted a little over a decade. And so the year of the start of the conflict itself is very important. This was just a couple of years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so, as we all know, the collapse of the USSR had a cascading effect on various parts of the world, including in sub-Saharan Africa. And so, to understand what happened in countries like Sierra Leone and Liberia, and a few of these other countries that experienced instability in the early 90s, we have to sort of understand what happened at that global level as well. And so with the collapse of the Soviet Union, among other things, not to go too much into detail, was the proliferation of arms, small arms and light weapons. And sub-Saharan Africa, unfortunately, was adversely affected because these weapons easily made their way into these different countries. And so the civil war there lasted for a little over a decade, between 50,000 to about 75,000, according to various estimates. Sierra Leoneans lost their lives in that conflict, and more than 2 million people were displaced, either internally or also externally as refugees. And this was something that this country had never experienced before. And just to kind of give a primer, I was born in Sierra Leone. I was raised there, and so this war happened during my formative years. And so a lot of questions were asked where people were like, well, how did we get to this point?
Mm-hmm.
How did we go from being a relatively stable and peaceful country to one that suddenly degenerated into this orgy of conflict?
Mm-hmm.
And so the book really, among other things, looks at the role of civil society, because I noticed, among other things, that there were a lot of gaps in our understanding of contemporary conflict in sub-Saharan Africa in particular. Often the focus tends to be on state actors, non-state actors that are armed. So, for example, rebel movement or armed group jihadists and all of that stuff, as well as on international non-governmental organizations. It is not often that mention is made, let alone credit is given to domestic organizations, to domestic indigenous groups that actually play a crucial role in fostering peace, in helping to reunite different fragments of the society. And so this book really is sort of focusing or is analyzing the role of various civil society organizations. And when I say civil society, it is a reference to the non-governmental sector that is wedged in between the state and the for-profit business. So women's groups, community organizations, civic associations, traditional institutions such as the chieftaincy, youth groups. So these are all examples of indigenous civil society organizations that were crucial to fostering peace and stability in Sierra Leone. And so this book really sort of aims to give the context to how they came about and what their contributions were, both during the conflict as well as in the years following the end of the conflict itself.
Ah, that's wonderful. Thank you very much for that. I understand that this book was published under the Routledge series on peace, conflict, and security studies in Africa. What do you think is the major contribution of the book to that discourse?
Yes, thank you so much. So the book is definitely part of a series that looks at the implications of various themes for peace and stability in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, or Africa in general. So the idea behind the series by Routledge is to bring together scholars that write on various themes that have implications for this particular theme. So this book is just one out of several. And among the many themes that the series deals with is everything from community violence and peace building in, say, Nigeria, to civil society, obviously, in Sierra Leone, human rights violations in Sudan, and so on. So there are lots of these different kinds of examples. So the idea behind the series is to sort of bring a house, sort of an in-house expertise on these various themes so that readers can see the connections between the issues, both at the micro but also at the macro level, that has implications for contemporary stability in Africa in general. And this particular series is, edited by, a wonderful analyst, Obi of Nigeria, who works for the Social Science Research Council. And so everything, as I mentioned, from disarmament to demobilization of child combatants to education, is all sort of part of this series. And so it has definitely relevance for sub-Saharan Africa. But also this book that I published, my book, even though it's a case study on Sierra Leone, the lessons that can be drawn, and I can talk about that later on in the process, the lessons from the Sierra Leone case studies is very much relevant to goings on in different parts of Africa in particular, but also the world in general. And so that's sort of how this series fits into that narrative as well, that even though it's a case study, its implications goes beyond the confines of Sierra Leone, which really, when you think of it, it's one of the smaller countries in sub-Saharan Africa. But it has a major implication for lessons learned about what's going on elsewhere.
Interesting. Thank you very much for that. So, what are the major findings of the book? And I like that you already introduced the theme of the major lessons. What are the major findings of the book, and what major lessons can we draw from those findings?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And so the book itself, so the title, Civil Society and Peace Building in Sierra Leone, Donors, Government, and Human Security. And so in the book, I'm really very much focused here on the intersectionality between these various themes and how they relate to civil society. So I explore the role of donors, because as we all know, the international aid architecture is dominated by usually large international donors, most of which are based in the West. But one of the key findings, something that actually surprised me, is that these donors are crucial. There's no doubt about it. They're crucial to fostering peace and stability in countries that experience conflict. But what is also important to note here is that there are a lot of other traditional and indigenous donors that are actually based in sub-Saharan Africa. But so far, their roles are often not understood. And so one of the key findings really is that funding comes not just in the form of money from the West, as crucial as those are, but there are also lots of expertise and, of course, funding as well that are indigenous, that comes from different parts of the African continent itself. And so for me, that part was very crucial. The other finding is that donors, international donors, actually shape events on the ground in very profound ways. And all of these donors also have their own agenda. And so, as important as their roles are, all of these donors have certain goals and objectives that they are trying to meet. And whilst this is crucial to fostering peace, sometimes their goals and objectives are often not in line with the needs of these local communities. And so, as a result, there's often, major implications for peace and security in these settings as well. Donors have also their own preferences in terms of, what organizations they want to work with. Most donors, I found out, want to work with organizations that look like them, organizations that are set up in a way that the average donor funder in the West can understand. And so they require, organizations to have an office space, for example, a bank account, paid staff, professional staff, and all of that stuff, which is all great. But these organizations, which I call formal organizations, they are very small. The vast majority of the work of civil society often takes place at the grassroots level. And so this is where you have the real work that are taking place. And so the criteria that donors have, plus the reality in terms of how civil society organizations operate, are often not incongruent. And so the end result is that we end up with a sort of a tiered system where some preferred organizations get the bulk of the resources and support to the detriment of much smaller organizations whose organogram or setup may not be familiar with Western donors. So that's one. The other theme that I found out, which was also interesting, is this inherent tension between governments in Africa and civil society organizations. And so I look at this through the lens of post-colonialism, post-colonial theory. So the notion or the idea being that some of the challenges that these African countries face are to some extent also inherited from the colonial era. And so the goal in all of this is to kind of see how Africa's colonial past continues to impact the contemporary state structure within these different African countries. And so in the case of Sierra Leone, but also we'll see that in a lot of other developing countries, there's this inherent tension between civil society on the one hand and the government on the other. And so we see a situation where governments are trying to clamp down on civil liberties, on the press, for example, or on various other outlets. And so, again, the idea or the finding here is that this is actually nothing new. As a matter of fact, in the case of Sierra Leone, but also in the case of a lot of other countries in Africa, civil society was actually at the forefront of advocating for independence. So various women's organizations, professional organizations, lawyers, and all of these, they were crucial to asking for independence from whether it was the British or the French. And so those tensions were inherited in the colonial era as well, where various civil society organizations that were advocating for the masses almost found themselves directly in conflict with the government structures. And so, so there is sort of, there's this the tension sort of kind of wanes and waxes depending on which administration is in power. On the one hand, government needs civil society. They realize that the nature of governance is such that they don't have the technical expertise to be able to do most of the work, and so they need civil society.
Yes. Yeah.
But on the other hand, they also tend to be a little envious, and in some cases, they tend to clamp down on these rights. And so that was an interesting finding to see that some government do support civil society, but also in some cases they try to clamp down on these rights as well. The core finding in all of this, which really ties in to civil society, donors, and government, was what is the implication? And that's what I try to answer towards, almost I would say 2,000 into the book. What is the implication of all of this for human security? Because the discussion so far, when we talk about stability and security in Africa, sometimes or often tends to focus on state security, on the military, on the police force, on having a strong state, a strong leader. We tend to see that as an antidote to instability. But the book here argues that what is crucial and what's often missing in this debate is human security, which is basically a reference to all of the things that we require as humans to be able to live to our full potential. So the ability for you to wake up, dress how you want, go to where you want to go to, meet where you want to meet, whether it's for friends, for work, for fun, without necessarily having to look over your shoulders all of the time is really crucial. And so it's the ability for the human being to be able to live life in a way that helps them to fulfill these innate needs that Maslow and others talked about. And so human security, so everything having to do with human rights, but also the ability for us to gather and to be able to express our views on various issues, including governance, without necessarily feeling as if our life will be in danger. And so the book really focuses towards the end, two-thirds towards the end, trying to answer this question: what does all of this mean? What does the impact or the influence of donors? What does the impact of government's desire to clamp down on civil society mean for human security? But also, what does it mean for Africa in general? Because often Africa is associated, as we all know, with negative development. But the book also aims to show that, as a matter of fact, a good proportion of the yeoman's job, a good deal of the most complicated, the most difficult aspect of fostering peace and stability in sub-Saharan Africa is actually carried out by indigenous organizations. And so, so the book sort of aims to explore their role. But I also must add that the book itself is not it's not giving a pass to civil society. It's also a critique. And so for civil society agents or for folks that are interested in the role of civil society in post-conflict peace building, this book is crucial in the sense that it is also a critique of the civil society sector. So in other words, I argue throughout the book that it is by no means the silver bullet to Africa's challenges. That, as a matter of fact, civil society is also racked by contradictions. And the argument here is that, to a large extent, for us to understand civil society, to understand the wider society, we also have to understand civil society. What happens in this wider society is also reflected in civil society. So, cases of corruption, cases of discrimination, misappropriation of funds, So you do have bad apples even within civil society. And
Mm.
so the book argues that indeed for civil society to continue to maintain its relevance, there has to be a mechanism to weed out these bad apples to be
Mhm.
able to create a system that's more credible for all actors in that sector.
Oh, yes, yes. Thank you very much. And that argument that you make resonates with the experiences that most African governments have with international, in most cases, international civil society organizations, because they sometimes come with agendas that do not align with what a country wants to achieve at that particular time and context. And at the end of the day, they become caught up in partisan politics. They become caught up in regime change agendas and all that. The whole civil society industry becomes a politicized industry, and it becomes very, very toxic. So I think that's a very important contribution that the book makes. So now, as we finish up our discussion, I want you to tell us what you think is the specific target audience of this book. Did you have any target audience in mind when you were writing the book? Do you now have a different perception of the target audience? What is the target audience of the book?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, so most definitely I had a target audience in mind. I think this book will be very, very useful to anybody that is interested in global governance in general. So if you are like the big picture type of person, in the beginning, I look at the international aid architecture. So I look at the big picture in terms of where those global funding really fits
Mm-hmm.
into the bigger picture. So I also look at global civil society.
Mm-hmm.
So that definitely will be an area of interest. But also anybody interested in the work of the non-governmental sector.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody interested in the work of governments in contemporary Africa, but also, in the developing world,
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of these issues, you also find them happening in different parts of the world, not just in Africa, but also even in Asia, where there's
Mm-hmm.
this constant tension between the state and the non-governmental sector. But also anybody who is a student of democracy and human rights and human security, this book would be relevant to them as well.
Mm-hmm.
Because among many things that I did is to situate the book not just as an isolated case study, but
Mm-hmm.
rather one that has relevance to what is going on, especially in Africa, but also around the world as well. Because, as I mentioned, there's still a lot that we need to learn about indigenous civil society groups. Because, as
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned in the beginning, these are organizations that have largely gone under the radar. We don't seem to know a whole lot about the work that they do in promoting peace and stability in different parts of the world. And so this book kind of aims to fill that void. So I think, this will appeal to students of history because, again, there's a whole chapter there that looks at historiography. So the notion that civil society did not just fall from the sky,
Mm-hmm.
but rather, there's a historical context that helps us to understand the origin as well as, why, the contemporary functions of civil society as well. So sociology, obviously, peace and conflict studies and African studies in general. So it
Mm-hmm.
appeals to a much broader audience.
Audience.
Right.
Wonderful. Wonderful. I like that. One of the most important themes and emphasis of our particular platform is the interdisciplinary nature of engagements and of the publications that we get to discuss. And this is what the book does very well. Viewers and listeners, do not forget to click the link that is in the description panel on the upload for this video. You can click it, you can get a copy of the book, and you can get to access it. Dr. Kanyako, thank you so much for making the time.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
No, thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate this. This is a wonderful opportunity. Thank you for having me on this platform.
Mm-hmm.
And I look forward to future engagement. I'm actually working on another book
Wow.
that looks at student movement, student peace movement,
Uh-huh.
again in Sierra Leone, but again looking at the bigger picture.
Okay.
And I'm hoping you get to interview me again
Oh
sometime
yeah,
soon
yeah,
when
yeah.
that book is ready.
Definitely, definitely. I'll be happy to popularize it. There's a Zimbabwean friend of mine who just did a book on a similar topic, but looking at Zimbabwe. I was looking at the student movement in Zimbabwe and Southern Rhodesia. Sorry, Southern Africa generally. How students' movements in Southern Africa have contributed to like democratization and all that. So yeah, I am very happy. I've heard you.